One of the things we want to talk about today is just margin, right? Like, what is profit margin? What is overhead?
Yeah.
I think it gets more complicated. Again, we've talked about person who's going out on their own, starting their business, right? Hey, I got to get cash flow in. I sold a job. I'm working a job now. Money's coming in. But as jobs start to stack up, over time, understanding like what is my margin, what's my overhead, and how much money is the business making? Because it's more than just customer one gave me money and I did work. Customer two, but it's figuring out how much money are you actually making.
Yeah. I mean, and margin, we use the word in all kinds of different areas of life. I mean, margin is just space that we try to allow on our calendars to get between places. It's margin in life of just not trying to do too many things where we have space to spend with our families, rejuvenate. So we use this term in all kinds of contexts. If you're a printer, you leave margin around the pages so you can, hold them and you can read things. I mean, it's a very important aspect of life. And then in business, obviously we have a little bit of a same kind of idea. It's that space between our costs and what we end up charging the customer. And profit margin, we'll leave like the gross operating net profit margin for the accountants. But let's make this simple today. We don't want to bore anybody any more than we have already. So people are dropping like flies right now. Where do we? Next,
it switched over to Joe Rogan.
Right. Exactly. Clearly these guys have no idea what they're doing, which is true.
Yeah.
At least on podcasts.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, we want to have margin to be able to pay our operating expenses, reinvest in the business, have money to take home. That's the idea, having that space between our costs and what we're going to charge the customer.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a little bit of a disconnect when we talk about overhead. Like, what is overhead? And I see the most confusion in the guys I talk to in contracting, their misunderstanding of what overhead is. And so I think we should just dive into overhead.
Yeah. Yeah, so if we get into, I think the basic definition of margin makes sense. It's like, it's extra space, like it's in the space you need to cover mistakes, cover gaps.
Great point. The mistakes.
Yeah, like you don't fill a cup up to the brim and then walk around with it. You need margin to give you space to move, breathing room, that thing.
Yep.
So about overhead, I think it's something that people probably, it's a big word, but like break it down for me. What's typical overhead in a contractor's business?
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest ones is missed. Like the typical ones. What's the rent for the office? What is the phone cost? I mean, these are overhead items. Like the electric bill. We're talking about costs of equipment, tools, all the rest of it. But what is? I mean, at the end of the day, some of the big one that's missed is some of the office expenses, like labor. You have an office manager. He or she is not producing anything, so that's overhead.
Yeah.
So any employee, and this is the one we miss ourselves. How much are if you're the business owner and you're not out there pounding nails, you're overhead.
Yeah.
You're not billing hours for yourself to a customer.
Right.
Somehow.
Yeah, you are not making money. Like you're not a revenue generating part of the deal anymore.
Right. Somebody else is pounding the nails, and whatever's left over covers your time and bidding the job and all the rest of it. So make sure we factor that in there.
Yeah.
That make that big mistake. So the labor expenses, non-production labor is overhead. So if somebody's not getting something done, it's not happening on the job, salesperson, office manager, any kind of supervisory type of things, it's all overhead. Then you got the office expenses, paper, electronics, all that kind of thing. Another big one, insurance. I mean, I think every business, particularly contracting, you're paying some big rates there.
Yeah. What type of insurance should everyone have?
Well, this is not something to cut corners on.
Yeah.
General liability is the easy one to get. Workman's comp is the expensive one. The owner exclusion is kind of the guy. If you're the single man shop, you can get an owner exclusion, pay $500 to $1,000 a year, get a policy that essentially covers anybody else that works for you, or a subcontractor that doesn't have it. So you need that because if somebody gets hurt on your job, even if you exclude yourself as the owner, and you have a great medical policy, I mean, what's the benefit? I mean, you probably pay for it on yourself anyway. It's not that expensive.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're just supervising, 3%, whatever,
Yeah.
pay it. But even if you exclude it, at least that gives you the opportunity, if somebody does go after you, you got a guy that said he had workman's comp, didn't have it, or it expired, he didn't pay his policy, you're covered from the client going after you.
Right.
So, yeah, workman's comp, get it.
Yeah.
And then obviously,
these are all recurring costs too, right?
Right.
These are things where you got to factor in the cost of doing business.
So it is sort of tied with production. If you're not having anything getting done, you're not paying workman's comp on it necessarily. So it is more of an operating expense related to like your general liability insurance and your base workman's comp fee, if you really want to break it down, is overhead. But Then you got your advertising, interest on your loans, that kind of thing. That's your overhead.
Yeah. That's basically your cost of doing business, right?
Yep.
Like, so I think, someone goes into business, and this might sound very generic, but, customer one pays you $10,000 for a job. You didn't make $10,000.
Yep.
Right? Like, you have your overhead costs you got to factor in to figure out how much are you actually making.
And the fun thing about this is it goes up over time. So suddenly you go from
Yeah.
And it's tough to track too. I mean, here we go into business together. We're having a great old time. We got one truck and pouches, and the rest of it costs us hardly anything to do business. Then we're like, let's get legit, get an office, hire an office manager, and we're still charging 10% overhead. And I think it kind of gets into the whole, where we have this scenario where two guys could be charging different markup rates off of their costs of things.
Mm-hmm.
You might be charging $1,000 to do a job. I'm sorry, your cost for the job are $1,000. You mark it up 20%. I come along, my costs are identical, but I mark it up 30%. And say we both walk away with 10% profit at the end of the day, assuming our costs are the same, well, I just got higher overhead than you do.
Right. Because you might have an office manager. Right. You might have, more month-to-month costs. So someone needs, if you're in business, you need to understand what your overhead is.
Yeah.
How should you, and you should calculate on like a month-to-month basis, like should you have a picture of, hey, month-to-month, this is what I expect my overhead to be, and how do you calculate that?
So it's not necessarily all that complicated to calculate outside of accounting software. You can pull reports on it and maybe even talk to your accountant about getting, if you have one, if you're doing it yourself, then you basically need to pull some out into a spreadsheet and say, okay, what really are my overhead expenses? And then track them, not just month to month, but maybe look at them over a period of time. So you can see what's going up, what's going down, and then make sure you don't miss something that you get billed one time for. A lot of guys are paying their general liability insurance for the entire year up front. So it's part of their overhead, but you got to average it across.
Yeah. Every June, my overhead jumps up by several $100s.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So averaging it out, getting the spreadsheet together or a list, paper, whatever, getting together, saying these are my expenses, this is what I'm paying in the aggregate, this is what I'm paying per month. Is it going up?
Yeah.
So knowing what it was last month, knowing what it is this month. In my business, when I was contracting, we ran across this variable rate of overhead depending on as we grew, the overhead went up. Well, really, the base expenses went up. But at the same time, we're supposed to be getting more done because of that overhead, right?
Right.
We have an estimator. We can bid more jobs. We've got an office manager. We can hopefully manage the office better. And, my time's freed up to do other things. I could sell more jobs or whatever's going on. So, in theory, increased overhead means increased production. But you need to know what your production rate is, because sometimes the overhead increase doesn't tie to increased production.
Yeah.
You buy a new truck, does that really increase your production?
Right. Yeah. I think it's where probably guys get a little haywire is, they assume that, growing what actually is growing your business, is hiring an office manager going to help you make more money or not? And then how do you calculate that into what you're bidding and estimating jobs at to cover that monthly overhead? So if you're building, how should you approach then? I need to price my work the right way so that I can obviously cover my overhead, which is my recurring expenses. That's just the cost of doing business. You are not actually making any money on any of those things. That's just the cost of doing it. So how do you build in margin? Because that's the goal, right? You're trying to build margin into your job so that you're making more money than you need to make to cover some of that extra space. So how do you price jobs? And what's the importance of understanding overhead? How do you calculate those things in there to make sure that your production rate is actually getting you paid? Because some people grow their business, right? They hire somebody on. They have 2 or 3 people working for them. They get an office space. They start doing these things, and maybe their volume of work is going up, but they're actually making less money. That happens all the time.
Oh yeah.
What's the pitfall there, and how should you? What approach should you take to growing your business in that space?
If you know what the overhead, what constitutes your overhead. First off, these are my categories. These are my costs. My business, went from being a couple of grand a month to being up to $32,000 in 1 month. We had an overhead just related to, it's just crazy.
Yeah.
Payroll for office staff, equipment, all the rest of it. And when I talk about equipment, it's more or less that maintenance of things. You're talking about mileage on your trucks, and some of that you can probably tie into production somehow. But it's tough to do that, so we just said, hey, that's overhead. That's cost of doing business.
Yeah.
And it added up to a big chunk of money. So what you need to know is what can we output as a company? What's
Yeah.
our production output? And the output is basically the services you can render and the materials you can deliver, and this is what you can put out. This is what you can charge people to do in any given period of time. So if you got 4 guys working, and for different businesses, it's going to be slightly different. If you're doing fixed costs, this is a real tricky one because you're telling somebody, I'm going to do a $50,000 job. If you can get $25,000 of that job done in a month, your production output is $25,000.
Yeah.
If you have $5,000 of overhead, $20,000 of that job is for your materials and for your profit.
Right.
The other 5, you'll never. I mean, obviously that went to pay the bills.
Right.
If you have 2 jobs going on, you kind of dilute it some.
Yeah.
You got 2 jobs, you got $25,000 that you, and it's not what you build the customer; it's what you got done. It's
Yeah.
production. You know?
I think that's a good thing because you can sell a job, but then you got to complete the job. So if I sell you a $50,000 job, but I'm only capable, that's going to take me 2 months of time to do it.
Yep.
My production output is $25,000 a month. If I've got overhead that's creeping up because I've got this support staff and I had to get that new truck and I had, all of those things, if that number's creeping up and outpacing my production, it doesn't matter how many jobs you sell. Because I think that's the thing too, is where you get that contractor who's robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Yep.
And I got, initial, and so then I'm spacing out. Now I'm going to a different job site every day of the week to keep customers just happy enough to hopefully get those jobs finished to get enough, again, dollars coming in to cover this month. And I think that's where people go south is it's not just about selling work. It's about managing your overhead and creating margin by understanding your production output of what can you do.
And it's tricky to track that because, I mean, some jobs are more complex than others. And if you're in that space of remodeling and you're trying to gauge, well, how far along really are we at this point in the job, it's tough to gauge that. And what we did was to basically break down the original scope of work and estimated costs and look at, okay, we got each line item demolition and then the sub lines of demolition, and then we check off, okay, what was done and what was the cost associated with that, or a percentage of it.
Yeah.
So if we had half done with the demo in the aggregate in a month, we'd say, okay, well, that was, if we bid $10,000 for the demo and we got half of it done, well, we earned $5,000 on that. What we billed the customer is irrelevant. They might have paid 20% up front. Well, you didn't earn 20% yet.
Right.
So the cash might be in the bank, but is totally unrelated to understanding our picture of overhead.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead.
Well, if you don't get this, what happens is you get into the red light, green light budgeting, right? And you might do with your personal budget where it's like, hey, there's money in the bank, light's green,
Right.
Let's go get the new shoes, or whatever the thing is that you do in
Right.
your personal money. I think in your business, you can do the same thing. It's like money in the bank doesn't mean profit earned and doesn't mean that you actually are making money. It means there's money in the bank. There might be cash flow, but if there's not margin because you don't know your overhead and you haven't measured your production output, you can still very much go bankrupt. It might take you a year or 2 to get there. But if you don't understand these principles, I think what happens is, I call it the red light, green light budgeting. Like, hey, money in the account's low. Like, we've all been there personally. It's like, guess you're not spending money this month. The account's low, red light, But you've got to be strategic and smart about how you're spending that money, knowing how much is coming in, what is in your pipeline, what are the costs you do business every month, and then bidding jobs appropriately, to make sure that you're actually making money.
Yeah. Let's talk about calculating.
Sure.
Because here's a that's one of the mistakes that's really easy to make in this whole thing. So we figured out what our production output is, and then we start looking at the percentages of that. We start saying, okay, well, we got $25,000 of work we could produce, or let's talk about another scenario. Not to leave these guys out. Let's just say you're billing time and materials.
Yeah.
And so you've got, let's say you got 2 guys working for you, carpenter, technician, whatever, your HVAC. You got 2 technicians out there doing work. You've got your office staff supporting that. If those guys can work, they got time off and everything else. So you averaged across a year. If they're working 160 hours every month, it's 173 hours if you're working full time, 8 hours a day. So let's take off 13 hours for average across the year for calling sick, not working, whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe that's even too high, 160 hours of output. But you got 160 hours, just for easy math. Across 2 guys, you got 320 hours of production in a month. If you're billing, say, $60 an hour, you got $19,200 of production that you can bill for in a month.
Yeah.
And your overhead's coming out of that. The cost of labor is coming out of that. So, but it helps us understand a little bit of the picture here.
But I think it's it's important to understand, like, hey, what does it all cost, and what do I need to price things at to actually make money?
Yep.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, it seems quite simple. We just need to figure out our costs, mark it up appropriately, track it over time and make sure that as things go up, we're adjusting things appropriately. As production increases, as our output, we can charge more in a month for the stuff we get done.
Yep.
We've got that overhead's not outstripping our production.
Yeah.
It's happened in my business.
Yeah.
1 month we just, got nothing done. I mean, we're just doing corrective work. We're going back there, finishing jobs off, doing the punch list.
Yeah.
You're not billing anybody for punch list. Nobody's paying extra for the punch list.
Yeah. Yeah. No money came in that month.
Right.
You're busy. You were working, but all those things those are production hours.
Yep. And suddenly the overhead goes to the roof. The other part about this, Drew, that I think we need to dive into next is really talking about what happens in a scenario where you understand both of these numbers, the production output, you understand your overhead, but you have that month where you're slow. You need to be able to track and see how that fits in the overall picture and understand the overhead over time because
Right.
you know your production rate over time.
Yeah. Because you're going to have feast and famine, right?
Yep.
You're going to have months that go really well and months that don't.
Yep.
And planning for that in advance, so you're not going month to month, week to week, hoping you can make ends meet. Again, going back to where we started, which was creating margin for yourself.
Yep.
And some of that's margin it's always financial, but when you can create margin financially, it also gives you some margin mentally, right? To where you are not stressed out over every single thing because you've got some margin that you've baked into the process.
So it sounds really heady. I mean, we talked about some,
Yeah.
throwing math around.
Yeah.
Not everybody loves math. A lot of us hate
Right.
it. But at the end of the day, diving into this and really trying to understand it would just do wonders for your business. It's
Yeah.
something every guy's got to figure out.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that, it's part of what we're doing as a business and developing our software is really trying to nail
Yeah.
this problem.
We're trying to help guys create predictable outcomes.
Yep.
Like, how do you know? I mean, math might be math, but you want to know, like, what I really want to know is, am I making money or not? At the end of the month, what was my profit? How much money am I taking home? Can I take my family on vacation or not?
Yep.
Those are things you got to know. And at the end of the day, if you don't have a math-based process in line about what is your overhead, what's your margin, how much money are you making, how much you need to charge to create that outcome for yourself, you'll end up not getting it. You're going to be in the back seat of your own car hoping that you arrive to profitability with someone else driving. I think understanding this and getting a grip puts you back in the driver's seat of your own business, making sure you can get where you need to go financially to make sure you're sustainable, you're profitable, and you're enjoying your work, enjoying your life.
When we implemented this in my business, it was revolutionary. When I understood week to week what the overhead was for the previous week based on how we average it across, like saying,
Yeah.
well, we're paying this amount of money every month. We could figure out the overhead percentage weekly because we knew how much we produced. So we'd say, this is the rate that goes up, and we would track that over time. It was so freeing because we'd know what we made last week.
Right.
We knew
Yeah.
if we made money.
Yeah.
And then the other fun thing about this too is if you knew you lost money, you'd say, well, why?
Yeah.
And so suddenly you'd have that data that you really say, oh, you know what, we did something for free. Let's go charge that guy. Let's have
Yeah.
the conversation.
Right.
Let's do a change order. And
Yeah.
so it does wonders for your business. So
Especially as you grow, the
Yep.
bigger you get, the more
Yep.
this has to be dialed in.
Love
Yeah.
I'd love for some feedback from our audience on this. Who are the one or two guys that stuck with us to the end. Yeah.
Cool. All right, Ben, I appreciate the time. Again, talking about why good guys fail and how do we help overcome some of those roadblocks and pitfalls of the business. Understanding margin, overhead, big part of it. So thanks for talking us through it.